I could briefly touch on the importance of data for law reform, the challenges in working with courts and with legal institutions in gathering data, and then speak more specifically from my prior work on data around judicial appointments. The one reason why I at least got into looking at data and as a way of engaging with judicial and legal processes more broadly is the anchoring effect of data. When we have data and we have hard numbers to describe describe reality, it ends up anchoring conversations, which is both good and bad. But so many things that we think of now as the common sense has emerged because there's been some hard data that has been put to the question. So the idea that the Supreme Court today, for example, is broadly an appellate court and its constitutional function is declining, may have been known to insiders, but as being part of the general conversation of the legal profession and a general view of the court has become possible because of a whole generation of effort on around ascribing numbers to the work that the court is doing. So there is a very powerful anchoring effect that data has, and it can shape our sense of the reality, the sense that we make of the reality, the common sense of that, of the profession, in this case the legal profession, or the institutions that we are studying. And well done, it can give a more holistic picture of what's actually happening. A large part of decision-making and policy-making in India, and I don't mean only in the legal profession, but in India more broadly, is very anecdotal and impressionistic. I've had the privilege of working quite extensively with the Law Commission of India, and this is something that we were finding there as well, that many decisions that are made for law reform are made on anecdotal, impressionistic accounts of what might be happening in the world. And we know that these accounts obviously are incredibly subjective, and given the exclusion of diverse voices from these decision-making spaces, are likely to reflect a very partial reality and a very partial reality of those who are already in power. So a holistic picture may be possible if we do data well, right, and in a more holistic way. And it can both confirm our intuitions about that reality or challenge our assumptions about that reality. So just to give you an example from judicial appointments. This is, I think, a fact figure that was discussed in the previous session as well. The data on judicial appointments in the lower judiciary shows that about 40% of judges in the lower judiciary, in the subordinate judiciary, are women. And that seems to suggest, and the Supreme Court has suggested in its State of the Judiciary report, that this indicates that there is a huge progressive upswing in diversity in the judiciary, and that it's a pipeline question. Over time, we'll sort out the diversity question in the higher judiciary. But if you actually break down this data, and I saw Shruti from Vidhi somewhere, I'm relying on their data here. If you break that data down and see where these 40% women are coming from, you see that only 20% of the district judges at the district judge cadre, at the higher cadre in the lower judiciary, are women. And only 11% are directly coming in after 7 years of work experience, right? So at least 7 years of work experience, which is very close to the percentage of women who are there in the High Court as well, right? So it's actually perhaps not the case that exams are better for women as compared to, networking. Perhaps that's the case as well, but there might be other factors. That 7-year work requirement may be something that is impacting women in a way that we need to really carefully study. It's a question at least that we need to ask, and that's a question we may have to ask. I mean, there's decision in the next few days. I think we'll have a decision from the Supreme Court on whether there should be a mandatory 3-year, practice requirement before someone is eligible to be appointed even to the entry-level judicial positions. And I think there are lessons to be learned from there. So data opens up these possibilities of looking at facts and figures in a new way. Similarly, for the longest time, when we've engaged with decision makers within the profession about the absence of diversity and gender diversity in leadership positions and in the higher judiciary, we've been told that this is a pipeline problem. Right? That we don't have enough women entering, and that is why we don't have enough women at the top. As the pipeline sorts itself out, we'll have more women. Well, actually, the data does not bear this out. If you see the percentage of women who are in law schools across the country, and you see that not just at this snapshot, at this instance, but for the past 15, 20 years, and if you look at there's the AISHE reports, higher education reports, you'll see that about 32% of law students in the programs and graduating are women. The numbers drops drastically when it comes to the number of women who actually enroll in the bar, which is about 15%. 3.4% are senior advocates. 2% of state bar councils have women, none at the BCI, so on and so forth. So we see a very sharp decline. And the official story that the problem is about women entering the law may not be the case. Then if that is it's clearly a problem if it's only 32%, but it's not as acute a problem there as it is within the bar, right, in the enrollment to the bar. So the question is then structurally, what is it that is inhibiting women from entering the bar, and what are those structural interventions that can be made for law reform at that stage, right? So it allows us to ask very pointed questions. Having said that, data is also, of course, open to interpretation. And there is just like law, data is not objective, it is open to interpretation and misinterpretation and creative misinterpretation. And so any analysis or any inference drawing from data has to therefore be very carefully thought out. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why data plays such an anchoring effect and such a powerful catalyst in law reform conversations is because this myth of objectivity of data. So, but just to give you an example, I think this came up a little bit in the previous session as well. If you see a decline in the number of sexual harassment complaints, is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? Does that mean that sexual harassment is declining, or that sexual harassment complaints are declining? And that if you just look at that data without context and without having a theory that undergirds that inference, one can be misled very easily. Having said that, data gathering in India on the judiciary or on the legal profession is incredibly difficult. Our systems are not optimized for evidence-based decision making, and definitely therefore not for data-based decision making, which means that we don't gather data in a systematic way. So it's not as if courts are gathering data in a systematic way. It's not as if the legal profession is gathering data in a systematic way or storing it in a systematic way. So we've been filing RTI. So we have a parallel initiative, perhaps a sister initiative that's going on, where we're looking at where we are working with early career women lawyers in litigation, and we've been trying to get AIBE and Certificate of Practice data from across the country. And of course, we have to follow the RTI process because this data is not publicly available. To the extent that it is available, it is not disaggregated. It's aggregated data. It will give us data for the whole of Karnataka, but will not give us the kind of granular data with which we can make, run more sophisticated statistical tests on. So, and even when this data is available, very often it's available in physical forms, or you get a huge data dump that you don't know how to make do with. What that means is that very often we have to then go out and gather our own data. And that might mean, in this case, we are doing surveys because we're trying to get to women's experiences of the litigation profession. We are doing it through a survey form that's time intensive, that's money intensive. and it's difficult to sustain. So sustainability of data over time requires that the person who's generating the data is doing that data work, is maintaining that data, maintaining it in a robust, usable form, and that is publicly accessible, and that we don't have. Our firms collect a lot of data, right? But they collect it more as a matter of form rather than necessarily because there's some action oriented with that data. National level data work becomes incredibly difficult, of course, because we are a federal system. Being a federal system is not a bad thing, but that means that there are that many points of intervention that one has to make to get that holistic picture. And finally, just in terms of depending on what questions you're asking and what are the inferences that one is seeking to draw, there is a whole range of factors that need to go, a range of data points that one needs to be able to really study a phenomenon that one is studying. So look at diversity, right? We need robust demographic data. Now, clearly our courts are not in the business of collecting demographic data, even of the judges that they are appointing. Where does one, as an independent researcher, get that kind of demographic data? There is something that you can get from the profile of individual judges, but a robust sort of data that one can stand behind becomes difficult to get. And then if you want to draw an inference with respect to diversity, right? So for example, if I were to ask a question, does the Supreme Court prioritize excluded groups for appointment to the Supreme Court, right? Imagine if I was asking that question. I would need a level of granularity of data which is not sort of, isn't just about who this person is, what their gender is, what their caste is, but correlations, right? So is it, and particularly in the case of intersectional identities, what is it that is the driving factor, right? What are the drivers of this kind of of an appointment? And that level of granularity, again, is something that has to be baked into the system. It cannot be ex post facto. It's very difficult. Not that it cannot be, but very difficult to uncover ex post. I know Rangin's done a lot of work in this respect. So, of course, it can be done, but it's very difficult to do. With that in mind, just to give some sort of initial or very brief statistics with respect to judicial appointments that we found in our work. So our work looked at data on Supreme Court appointments from 1950 to 2018, and then looked at all High Court appointments from the start of the collegium system, so 1993 to 2018. And interestingly, I mean, of course, we know the picture with respect to, the headline items of gender diversity and caste diversity, that it's pretty much, it is not diverse. But if you look at Supreme Court appointments, an interesting shift that happens after the collegium system is that the collegium is drawing from a very small pool of people. It is largely drawing from High Court Chief Justices. So 86% of all collegium appointments up to 2018 were collegium appointments to the Supreme Court were from High Court Chief Justices, as compared to only 53% in the years prior, from 1950 to 1993, when it was an executive appointment system. Now, what that means is that if you have, if that pipeline question is a live question, and you have a bulk of people coming from the lower judiciary, their ability to get to the Supreme Court is going to be very difficult. You're not going to be able to sort that problem at the Supreme Court level if things don't change, because the collegium has really contracted the kind of people that it is drawing into the Supreme Court. Interestingly, then one would think that if the Supreme Court were interested and Supreme Court judges were interested in getting in more judges into the higher judiciary and higher into the higher judiciary, they would then appoint more women as High Court judges. Only 12 out of the 242 judges that the collegium has appointed have been 12 out of the 242 High Court Chief Justices that the collegium has appointed have been women, right? Interestingly, though, women get appointed at a later age than their male counterparts. And of these, the women who make it to the Supreme Court have to be generally High Court Chief Justices of multiple High Courts before they get to the Supreme Court as compared to their male colleagues. Now, the numbers are so small that we can't draw any statistical correlations. But it does point to something, right? It does point to the fact that in a seniority system, if women are elevated to the Supreme Court at 59.3 years versus men who are being elevated at 57.9 years, that just means that they're never going to get very high up in the system. Women are being appointed to high courts at a later age as compared to their male counterparts, which means that their ability to become chief justices and rise in that system is difficult. And that really points to the need for a very conscious intervention, right? A conscious diversity intervention. This cannot be sorted through a pipeline approach, right? That get in more women at the lower levels and the pipeline will take care of itself. The pipeline is broken. The pipeline is because of, and one can imagine what those reasons are. Women are coming in at a much later stage. Because women are coming in at a much later stage, they are not going to rise through the ranks if the surrounding conditions don't change. And so intervention in those surrounding conditions are particularly relevant if we want to see a greater representation of women in the higher echelons of the judiciary. I will stop with that and happy to take questions later.